This week, we're going to be talking about diversity in the classroom. So let's face it, our student population doesn't really look like this. They don't look like clones of one another. And I think that this acrostic of the word diversity gives us a bit of insight into the differences that we might talk about when we're talking about diversity in education. Perhaps we have had sessions in teaching courses that tell us to take into account the diversity that our students show. And mainly this refers to the learning styles that our students might exhibit. Those who are visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, or tactile, if you want to call it that, for example. These styles usually refer to a person's preferred way of perceiving information, but by no means does that mean that we prefer one to the exclusion of the others. In fact, it is a well-demonstrated psychological phenomenon that the more senses we involve, the better the learning will be. The brain is much more suited to processing visual information than anything else, because the nerve cells devoted to visual processing account for about 30% of the brain's cortex, compared to only 8% for touch and 3% for hearings. So it's no wonder that the majority of us say we're more visual than anything else. According to developmental molecular biologist John Medina, in his book Brain Rules, which, by the way, I highly recommend you read, tests show that people can remember the content of more than 2,500 pictures with at least 90% accuracy 72 hours after exposure, even though the subjects see the picture for only about 10 seconds. Recall rates 1 year later still hovered around 63%. How many of us would like our students to remember 90% of what goes on in our classroom? This same research says that if new information is presented orally with no image present, people only remember about 10% of what was presented 72 hours after exposure to the information. So there you have it. If you just talk to your students, there's about 10% retention of what you say 3 days later. But the percentage remembered goes up to 65% if a picture is added to the new material after the fact. It turns out that the reason for this is that the eye processes and interprets the content of complex imagery, such as photographs, 60,000 times faster than it does words. So these differences in learning styles might be interesting, but they do not represent the depth of the diversity factors. So even though we think that learning styles, as in the visual, auditory, kinesthetic division, are important, they are not the categories that I'm referring to here as diversity. Nor do I think is the fact that we can recognize that our students have different preferences for expressing what they know, as well as learning it, through what has come to be known as the multiple intelligences theory. This, for me, is not what diversity means. These differences can be important, but when it comes to diversity in the classroom, I want to talk about something that's a bit more radical. One of the aspects that we might look at is age. Do we treat our students of different ages differently? And not just with reference to the cognitive capabilities that go along with each age. Do we treat those older students with a more lenient or with a stricter tendency, for example? If you're teaching in a school context, as most of you are, this might not be an issue because most of the kids in your classroom will be about of an equal age. But if you work in a language institute, it could be. How seriously do you take your older students, your younger students? Do you think you cannot teach an old dog new tricks? Or would you tend to say the future belongs to the young? Or are there any other old sayings that could explain how teachers might approach students of different ages differently? Take a look at your course book. Does it have anything of interest for older students or those who don't fit into the mainstream profile? Another of the outwardly noticeable differences, of course, is gender. How differently do we treat our male students as compared with the female students? Are certain types of answers acceptable from one group but not the other? What about behavior? Do you accept a certain type of behavior from the guys but not the gals in your group? Or vice versa? Who gets to answer questions more often? When questions are posed to the group in general, rather than directing them at an individual student by name, research shows that boys are more likely to answer. Have you found this to be true? When doing group work, do you put the men and women together or in separate groups? Does this have any effect on the work that's done? You might be surprised if you change this around and have one gender group, only women working together on a task, and vary that with groups that might combine and be of both men and women. What about sexual orientation? This probably doesn't even come up in our class, we think. But do we automatically ask a boy about his girlfriend? Or a girl about her boyfriend? What about when you talk about plans for the future, such as, do you want to get married, have kids? Is there any provision in your class for an alternative lifestyle? Maybe these seem like very difficult questions. They're kind of the hot potatoes that no one wants to talk about. But when we don't allow for them to be addressed, we are still sending a message about what we believe is right and wrong. A lot of times we send out messages as to our own preferences and are not aware of how our students interpret this. As teachers, I really believe it is our obligation to be as inclusive and accepting as possible of any of the GLBT orientations. Although this may not seem to be an issue where you work, you would again probably be surprised at the diversity that exists under the surface. As teachers, I really believe it is our obligation to be as inclusive and accepting as possible of any of the GLBT orientations. Although this might not seem to be an issue where you work at the moment, you would again probably be surprised at the diversity that exists under the surface. In the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a real revolution in textbook production, and any book that doesn't show a variety of ethnic groups among the characters is basically doomed before it gets published, if indeed it does get published. Especially since most of the materials we have access to are marketed worldwide. Still, is there enough awareness of it in your classroom? Do you look for ways to get your students to describe characteristics that are not just skin deep, such as everyone has brown eyes, dark hair, dark skin? Do you help them see that a stereotypical English speaker who is white, blonde, blue-eyed, probably male, is not the only or even the best example of a good language learner or English speaker? Do you help them feel pride in who they are? Students' assessment of their own efficacy, their belief in their own capabilities and possibility to be successful, can be heavily influenced by ethnic stereotyping. Have your students ever commented something like, "We Mexicans have a difficult time with English. It isn't in us to be good language learners. Look at the statistics. Mexicans can't speak English." Are we doing anything to either uphold or break down this belief? This is one of my favorite areas for bias in the classroom, intellectual capabilities. How do we differentiate for those students who are the brightest and really need very little from us, but seem to be the focus of most of our attention, and also cater for the needs of the less able students who could do well but need more guidance and perhaps more encouragement from us, more attention? Are we willing to take the time to really provide for all our students? With the large groups we find in most schools, this can place a huge demand on the teacher's time and energy. It's hard enough to come up with all the tasks and activities we want the main group of learners to complete, without having to try to think of providing for these two extremes, either the super bright students or the weaker ones. Is there anything we can do about this? I'd love to hear your comments on it in the forum. Probably the category closest to my heart is the way we provide for diversity referring to special needs. These could be students who have difficulty moving around, holding a pencil, speaking clearly, sight-impaired students, or hearing-impaired students. Almost all of the teaching textbooks that I use with my BA groups presuppose that the students they will face will be, number one, highly motivated, two, situated in an ideal-sized group of no more than 15 students, three, have no outside distractions like parents getting a divorce or a car accident on the way to school, or being held up on the bus and losing not only their lunch money but all of their school books and many other things that happen in real life. But rarely do my students find these characteristics in a class once they get out into the workplace. So we sometimes are preparing future teachers for a utopia that they will not find. Here at the Faculty of Languages, and I would think in most places around Mexico, there has been an increase in the diversity of special needs students that we can find in our classrooms. We've been privileged here to have a diversity of students over the years, including sight-impaired and mobility-impaired students. I like to think that for the most part, the teachers and staff have been very sensitive to these different needs, but I must admit that this does not apply to 100% of the cases of either teachers or others. There's a hidden tendency to think that normal is best. Of course, this all depends on how you define normal. And that everybody else either needs to adjust to these normal patterns or get out of the way. Let's face it, our world is made for those who are young, thin, and healthy. And if you don't fit into that pattern, you're left out. Stairs to climb, sidewalks to maneuver are just a part of it. What other things in a teaching context cater only to the normal student? How much of your teaching would be understandable to a person who cannot hear you well, who cannot see you? Do these special needs mean that those students don't deserve to learn English, don't deserve our attention, that we think they cannot learn English? These are some pretty deep questions to think about. Although, as far as the most recent census shows, Mexico is a predominantly Catholic country, about 86%. That doesn't mean that everyone is Catholic. Have you ever analyzed your speech to see how much of it presupposes that your students are going to be celebrating certain dates, for example? Christmas celebrations, Easter holidays, all start out with us thinking that there is no other way and nothing else to celebrate. But in addition to different family traditions, have you ever done anything to promote this understanding of other religions or belief systems? So when we're looking at diversity in the classroom, remember that it's a lot more than just different levels of motivation or different learning styles. All of the traits that tie us to a certain group, religious, social, ethnic, age-related, or otherwise, are reasons to look at diversity in the classroom. I think it's well worth the time to take a long look inside of ourselves and reflect on how inclusive or exclusive we are when addressing the diversity in our groups. I hope that this has given you food for thought, and that after looking at the other short video and reading the text that I've provided, in your participation in the forum, you share with us your thoughts on the topic. Thank you.